A short story by Othniel Max Daves. The Star Chamber. In the heart of the ancient temple, beneath the eternal gaze of the stars, sat Luminar Aeternus, the seer who had lived longer than most men could fathom. His eyes, clouded with age, saw far beyond the realm of mortals, peering into the depths of human folly and cosmic justice. He sat in silence, listening to the winds whisper of empires rising and falling, of kings and fools, of nations that thought themselves invincible beneath the cold light of the moon. The moon had always been a false beacon to Luminar, a deceptive reflection of a greater truth, one that many were too blind to see. How strange it is, Luminar mused to the stars, that the proud revel in the dim glow of the moon, thinking themselves wise, their deeds hidden in its shadows. They dance under its pale light, believing their actions escape the eye of justice. Yet, like the moon itself, their power is borrowed, their time finite. His voice was soft, but the weight of his words carried across the winds. He had seen this pattern play out for centuries. The foolish, the arrogant, reigning over the world with the false sense of security that darkness affords. They spoke boldly, unaware that their very words were the chains being forged for their own undoing. They mock the cosmic court, Luminar whispered, standing naked in their corruption, not realizing the rising sun will soon expose them. They think themselves above the laws written in the stars, and yet they prove the case against themselves with every passing day. How blind they are, thinking they can escape the consequences of their deeds. Luminar's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the first light of dawn began to break. It was the sun, the true light, that would render judgment. Under its piercing rays, no shadow could hide the corruption that festered in the hearts of men. The arrogant, the avaricious, the fools, they would stand before the great cosmic judge, and their own actions would be their condemnation. They forget, Luminar continued, that hell is not some distant place of torment beyond their reach. No, hell is of their own making. With every selfish act, every word of deceit, every moment of hubris, they carve their own path toward damnation. It is not forced upon them, it is chosen freely and arrogantly. His mind wandered to the great empires of old, kingdoms long since turned to dust. They too had once been proud, basking in the moon's false light, believing their power to be eternal. But like all things under the sun, they had fallen, their legacy is nothing more than a whisper on the wind. Nations are no different from men, Luminar reflected. Empires rise and fall, kingdoms expand and crumble, all thinking themselves eternal. Yet, they too are subject to the same cosmic laws. The sun will rise upon them as it does upon the foolish rulers, and their corruption will be laid bare. As the dawn broke fully over the temple, Luminar stood. The fools would continue their folly, the arrogant would continue to reign, but the sun would rise again and again, unrelenting in its truth. And when the time came, all would be revealed. For as long as the sun rose and set, the cycle of pride, folly, and consequence would continue. And Luminar Aeternus would be there, watching, waiting, and knowing that, in the end, the light would always prevail over the darkness. The Star Chamber, the second discourse. The moon hung high over the ancient ruins of the once glorious empire, casting a pale, deceptive light upon what was left of Rome. The marble columns, now broken and crumbling, stood as silent witnesses to the passage of time, to the folly of human ambition. Luminar Aeternus, the ancient seer, walked among them, his staff tapping rhythmically on the stone, his thoughts drifting between the seen and unseen realms. "The moon's light is false," Luminar murmured, gazing up at the orb that once symbolized the glory of emperors and the reach of their dominion. "It shows only what is shallow, what is temporary." Rome too was bathed in such light, believing itself eternal under the gaze of lesser gods, but even the brightest moon must fade before the rising sun. As he moved deeper into the ruins, the seer saw them not as mere stones, but as the remnants of a spiritual battle, a battle lost, not through the sword or the spear, but through decay of the soul. His mind, as always, returned to the axis mundi, the point where the temporal and eternal, the seen and unseen, intersected. The fall of Rome was not simply the collapse of a great empire, but the judgment of a world that had turned its back on higher truths. Historians speak of the barbarian invasions, Luminar mused, of internal decay and the slow, grinding collapse of empire. They talk of military defeats, economic failures, and political mismanagement. They speak truth, but it is only half the truth. What they miss, what they cannot see, is the spiritual decay that preceded all of it. He stopped before a fallen statue of a once great emperor, now cracked and weathered, his face worn away by centuries of neglect. "The city of man," he whispered, recalling the words of St. Augustine. Rome was always the city of man, glorious, yes, but built on foundations of pride, corruption, and hubris. Its splendor could never last, for it had severed itself from the eternal, from the city of God. As Luminar stood there, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the horizon. The light of the sun, true and unrelenting, slowly washed over the ruins, revealing every flaw, every crack, every scar of time. It was as if the rising sun itself rendered judgment on the empire that had once ruled the known world. The fall of Rome, he said, was not merely a consequence of external pressures or internal weaknesses, as many would have it. No, it was the result of a far deeper truth. The empire had lost its way, spiritually adrift, no longer anchored to the divine order. Many saw the fall only in terms of material decay, unable to see the spiritual forces at work. He mistook the symptoms for the cause. Luminar raised his staff, pointing it toward the horizon where the sun continued to rise, illuminating the ruins in full. Augustine saw it clearly. The fall of Rome was not a punishment, but a consequence, a reflection of the unseen reality that had been unfolding for generations. The city of man must always fall, for it is built on pride and ambition, not on the eternal truths that sustain life. He turned away from the statue, his gaze now fixed on the distance, where the golden light of the sun bathed the earth in warmth. Rome's fate is the fate of all empires, all nations that place their trust in temporal power rather than in the divine. They believe themselves invincible, but they are merely standing in the great cosmic courtroom, unaware that their actions, seen and unseen, have already condemned them. Luminar paused, his thoughts drifting to the modern world, to nations and leaders who, like Rome, stood on the precipice of their own ruin. They too stand naked in their corruption, believing that power and wealth will protect them from the rising sun. They too mock the unseen, laughing at the very forces that will bring about their end. With one last glance at the ruins, Luminar began to walk away, his staff tapping on the stones, echoing like the ticking of a clock, counting down the final moments of an age. The sun rises, and with it comes judgment. The city of God remains, but the city of man will always fall. The only question is, when will they see it? The Star Chamber, the third discourse. The star chamber was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of distant galaxies visible through the vast dome above. Luminar Aeternus stood at its center, gazing into the depths of the cosmos, his mind traveling across time and space. Before him lay the memories of countless kingdoms and empires, each a monument to the same tragic pattern, rising in grandeur, only to fall into ruin through the relentless force of entropy. From Rome to France and beyond, Luminar murmured, the thread of decay remains the same. Empires, like men, drift from purpose and truth, severed from the very foundations that once held them together. The chamber flickered with visions of grandeur, glistening palaces, triumphant armies, lavish feasts. Yet as Luminar looked closer, he saw the rot beneath the surface. Where once there was unity and purpose, there was now vanity, indulgence, and the slow unraveling of moral fiber. The dissolution of purpose, Luminar whispered, his voice soft. Against the silence of the cosmos. The elites of these realms forget the spiritual and moral underpinnings that gave them strength. Their pursuit of wealth, spectacle, and external validation is but a hollow echo of what once was. They dress themselves in finery, adorn themselves in jewels, but they are naked, naked before the rising sun of consequence. The images shifted, showing the elites in their splendor, cloaked in extravagance, parading through grand cities, surrounded by the adoration of the masses. Yet their eyes were empty, their souls adrift. They had replaced meaning with materialism, depth with spectacle. Vanity is a fragile mask, Luminar continued, his gaze piercing through the illusions. When a society's identity is bound to the external, wealth, beauty, power, it becomes fragile, susceptible to the shifting winds of public opinion. What is left when the jewels are stripped away? Only emptiness, only the void where purpose once thrived. He saw how the elites, once the shepherds of their people, had grown isolated in their towers of wealth. They no longer understood the plight of the common man. The connection between the rulers and the ruled had frayed, as the former became lost in their indulgences, and the latter in their struggles for survival. "The chasm widens," Luminar whispered, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Isolation breeds resentment. Elites fixated on their own vanities lose sight of the common good. The masses, left behind in the wake of indulgence, grow restless, angry, disconnected from the very fabric of society. And so begins the unraveling, the entropic spiral that leads to chaos." His mind shifted to the emotional volatility that now ruled these crumbling societies. What had once been a realm of reason, balance, and grounded moral foundations had devolved into a world of spectacle-driven, emotional outbursts. He saw revenge dressing, petty displays of power and superiority, rooted not in true strength, but in fragile egos and emotional wounds. He saw leaders who governed through fear, through manipulation of appearance rather than substance. When a society loses its grounding, Luminar reflected, emotional instability reigns. Without the anchor of deeper virtues, without the guiding light of purpose, all becomes reactionary, volatile, unstable. The spectacle replaces the substance, and the world is left chasing after fleeting shadows. Luminar turned his gaze from the adults who shaped these empires to the children, those who would inherit the ruins of these once great civilizations. They were raised in a world where value was tied to image, where worth was measured by material gain, and where emotional responses were amplified in the absence of spiritual grounding. "The young are the true victims," Luminar said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "They learn from what they see, absorbing the distorted values of a broken world. They are taught to seek approval in the eyes of others, to measure success by the weight of gold or the glint of fame. And in this, they lose their way before they even begin." Visions of children paraded before him, youth weighed down by anxiety, by the crushing pressure to conform to an image that was unattainable and hollow. They mimicked the vanity of their elders, clinging to status symbols, to the illusion of happiness through materialism, all the while growing more disconnected from their inner selves, their families, and their communities. "The future is written in the hearts of the young," Luminar spoke to the stars above. "But what future can they build when their hearts are shackled by the same chains of vanity and materialism that doomed their ancestors? Without spiritual renewal, without a return to deeper truths, they will carry forward the seeds of destruction sown by those who came before." As he spoke, the visions shifted again, this time to the broader implications of the moral decay that had taken root in these civilizations. He saw how the internal rot weakened not only the fabric of society, but the nations standing on the global stage. Once great empires, now fractured by internal corruption and mediocrity, were no longer able to lead or inspire. They had lost the moral authority that once commanded respect and influence. "They cannot see it," Luminar said, shaking his head. "But their vanity has left them vulnerable. Their materialism has left them weak. In their pursuit of self-gratification, they have sacrificed the long-term strength of their nations. And now, the world watches, as these once mighty empires falter, their influence waning, their power crumbling." The star chamber filled with the image of a world in disarray, nations embroiled in internal chaos, leaders more concerned with appearances than solutions, and the specter of external forces waiting to exploit the growing divisions. "The fall is inevitable," Luminar concluded. "For without integrity, without purpose, without grounding in the eternal, no empire can stand. They are bound by entropy, drifting ever toward decay." And so, the seer stood in silence, gazing into the vastness of time, knowing that the patterns of the past would repeat, unless those who led these nations and raised these children chose a different path. But for now, he could only watch as the cycle continued, as vanity and materialism led once great civilizations into the dark abyss of their own making,